Okay, so I think it's time I go ahead and finish my response to Shaun here, but in doing so, I'm gonna get to the point. Shaun's one main critique that he perhaps thinks is like a big deal is that Charles Murray used heritability to mean immalleability throughout the book, and that this is technically wrong. And this is true. Shaun's actually correct about this. This is technically wrong, or at least it would be technically wrong for Charles Murray to come out and say that heritability technically means immalleability. But Shaun, what do you think this means in practice? See, this is like Shaun just learned what heritability meant in making this video, and then took this technical point about heritability does not necessarily mean immalleability. He took that way too seriously. The example of height that Shaun uses is a good way to illustrate that Shaun is being a bit of a prude on this. Sure, height increases over time, and perhaps in the future we'll have some easily accessible technology or some pill that makes you 5 inches taller. And maybe you can say women today are about as tall as men in the Middle Ages were. I think men were still slightly taller, but it's pretty close. White women in the US are on average 5 feet 3.5 inches, while white men in Europe are around 5 feet 4 inches. So we have this male-female height gap today. Is that gap changeable? Well, we know it's very heritable, but does that mean genetic? Practically speaking, for the male-female height gap today, heritability means genetic, means immutable. Because while heritability is not technically malleability, it tells you what has been mallied in the time frame we're looking at, specifically the lifetimes of the subjects you're analyzing. Sure, potential environmental variables could cause all sorts of changes. Put a bullet in someone's head and you'll see a radical change in their IQ. Does this mean IQ is highly malleable? I guess if you want to look at it that way, but that's a really stupid way to look at it. When you take the heights of people in the past, we say we can't know if the male-female height gap is caused by genetic differences because look at how much height increased over the centuries. And also, here's some people who are starving in North Korea, so they're shorter than the South Koreans. That's a similar kind of pedantic so what statement as noting that getting killed lowers your IQ to 0. So there's a height gap between North Korea. That's caused by nutrition. Okay, does this mean the male-female height gap in the US is caused by differences in nutrition? No, that's stupid. We're not talking about North versus South Korea or the rise in height over time. We're talking about the cause of gaps today. And Shaun is making the same kind of silly argument on the rise in raw test scores over time. We're not talking about the rise in nominal IQ over time. We're talking about extant gaps within a predefined range of environments, namely the environmental variance within the US. And let's be clear, this is all about racial groups, especially blacks and whites in the US. That's why this is contentious. Even if we were talking about Hispanics, I don't think this would be so radically controversial because Hispanics haven't been sacralized and mythologized in the way blacks in the US have. And certainly there's no controversy in saying East Asians score higher than European Americans. It's really all about African Americans. The practical application of heritability goes like a bell curve. Once on the low end of understanding heritability, people just treat heritability as genetic, as immutable. Then you go up to the mid-range. You get into the midwits. Midwits like Shaun, who read about the topic and go, aha, that's not technically true. Look at the gains in height over time, right? Or he'll look at the Flynn effect. But then you get to a greater level of knowledge on the topic, or maybe just experience with these things, which is to say reading studies about intervention programs, for example. And once you know a little bit more about it, you conclude that functionally, yes, heritability means genetic, means immutable in the US today. That is, the really smart people and the really dumb people recognize the truth of that. And when this isn't the case, we know it isn't. Like with immigrant groups, and guess what? Those gaps go away in a single generation. Immigrant groups come to the US, they have a high heritability within group, but that doesn't mean it's immutable, right? And then their IQs go up in the next generation. All right, that's an exception, but we know when it happens. Okay. So when this is not the case, it's usually pretty obvious. Or like blacks in the continent of Africa. Say the median IQ of the continent of Africa is 70. Okay, I don't think that's all genetic. I think if we took those people, raised them in Western US environments, their median IQ would be 81. Even if the heritability of IQ within Africa was 100%, I would still think that if you plucked them out of sub-Saharan Africa and plopped them in the United States, their median IQ wouldn't be, say, 70, it would be 81. And that's the real world Murray is operating in when he talks about racial gaps, or in whatever it is IQ tests measure, a kind of intelligence. And when talking about group differences in particular, that's when the conflation of heritability and immutability is more appropriate. Because sure, environments can improve and that can raise this thing we call intelligence, but presumably everyone would benefit from those environmental improvements. And so group differences are going to be more immutable than the absolute level of the population average. And that is precisely what we have seen. We saw nominal IQ scores increase with the Flynn effect, but the gaps between demographic groups remain the same because IQ is a rank order score. It's force-fitted to a bell curve, so your IQ is actually a ranking. And we saw the same thing with gender differences in height. Nutrition improved, the heights of everyone went up, but the gender gaps remained the same. So even if theoretically the true intelligence gap between racial groups narrowed, it would be extremely unlikely for the race gaps in IQ to narrow, because what's actually happening there is that the lower intelligence people are catching up to the higher intelligence people, but it's like a slinky getting compressed. So sure, they get closer to the other end of the slinky, but they're not going to jump over another rung. Even if blacks were narrowing the gap on true intelligence, well, so would be less intelligent whites. And a white guy who's, say, 1% more intelligent than a black guy, he's going to get a little bit smarter too, so their position in the slinky doesn't change. The slinky just gets compressed. Now, if it gets compressed enough, then what happens is IQ scores, or really G, they become less meaningful, and people with an IQ of 80 are a lot more similar cognitively to people with an IQ of 120 than they were in the past. The IQ differences become less meaningful, but the rank order doesn't change and the IQ gaps aren't going to go away. But there's not even any evidence that this is even happening anyway. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary, but that's a topic for another time. With immigrant groups, that's the exception to this that proves the rule. Yes, they enter the US usually at a lower IQ than they'll end up, but most immigrants come from places with worse nutrition. Immigrants are an example of groups that have their IQs depressed from environment. Uncontroversially, hereditarians recognize this, and so take into account the genetic intelligence of immigrant groups, not their here and now expressed intelligence, because we know the next generation is going to rise up to their genetic intelligence potential if they behave like past immigrant groups. So heritability usually means immutability means genetic, and in the United States, for non-immigrant groups, this is generally true. And when it's not true, it's obvious that it's not true. So Shaun's needling of this concept is a bunch of bluster about nothing. African IQ and Shaun lacking perspective. Now, Shaun spends too much time going crazy about Richard Lynn's screw-ups, of which there are legion and which Lynn is quite famous for. But Shaun is being very short-sighted here. A low African IQ helps the environmentarian case, and it hurts the hereditarian case. Because say blacks in the continent of Africa had a median IQ of 85. That would be the same as the blacks in the US today. Okay, what then would that say about the importance of environment? If all the environmental problems of sub-Saharan Africa, things like illiteracy, malnutrition, disease, if that doesn't just smash your IQ, well then what does? You would have to imagine that things like iodine deficiency have virtually no effect, but what stereotype threat does? Compared to the environmental problems faced by sub-Saharan Africans, the black-white environmental differences in the US are trivial, with several environmental variables being in blacks' favor, such as stress levels, educational resources, and some aspects of nutrition. On the whole, blacks in the US probably do have worse environmental variables relevant to IQ, but they're going to add up to like 1 or 2 points. And in the real world, those 1 or 2 points are irrelevant because they're hollow for G. It's one or two education related points. Not really education related, but it's 1 or 2 environmental points. Not real G-loaded intelligence. They're not actually being made less intelligent, less truly intelligent by their environment, right? Intelligence of which IQ is an imperfect proxy of. Moreover, the blacks who face any significant environmental deprivation, they're already on the low end of IQ anyway. Taking a black person and raising his IQ from 75 to 80 is not going to matter in terms of real-world outcomes. You can do that a bunch and say, oh look, we narrowed the black-white IQ gap, but who cares? You just made a bunch of lower scoring people slightly less lower scoring. Yes, lower IQ blacks do have worse life outcomes than do higher IQ blacks, but intensively intervening and educating a black person so he gets good at taking tests and gains 5 IQ test points, you're not actually making him more intelligent, and you're not going to meaningfully improve his life outcomes. You're just going to associate the same life outcomes to a higher IQ. Now, Shaun trots out Lewanted's garden, and yeah, nothing in that is technically false, but it's dishonest to present it in just this way. Here's a garden I came up with. Within each plot, all the plants are genetically identical, but there's variance in soil. So within each plot, the heritability is 0, the environmentality is 100%. But between the 2 plots, since the soil distribution within each plot is identical, the difference between the groups is 100% heritable, meaning it's a 100% a function of genetic variance. So the within group heritability is 0, but the between group heritability is 100%. So yeah, within group heritability does not mean the same as between group heritability. Between group heritability could be larger than the within group heritability. And in fact, there's a good reason to suspect this might usually be the case, because within group heritability is the sum of all individual variance, while the between group heritability is comparing aggregates. Within a population, you have some people who say were abused as children, and they are developmentally crippled as a result. Okay, that will lead to a lower general heritability within the group. But when comparing 2 groups, the fact that both groups have some child abuse is irrelevant if they're facing child abuse at the same rate. Again, some people have worse soil, some people have better soil, but if their variation in soil occurs at the same rate, then that's going to be canceled out when comparing 2 groups. Only differences in levels of child abuse between the groups could reduce the heritability between the groups or any other environmental variable. What this means is that the range of environmental variance gets canceled out when comparing between groups, and so if anything, we should expect the between group heritability to be larger than the within group heritability. So say the heritability of IQ was only 60% generally, which means 40% of the variance being due to poor environments, and say the black-white IQ gap was 15. But the fact that some white people also had bad environments is going to dampen the environmental proportion of the between group variance, resulting in the between group heritability being higher than the within group heritability. So yes, between group heritability is not necessarily the same as within group heritability, but that goes both ways. Between group heritability could be higher than the within group heritability. Broad and narrow heritability and genetic determinism. What's funny about Shaun's video is he brings up the heritability of environment, and by his tonal inflection, he thinks it's some sort of mic drop. Shaun, the heritability environment doesn't eat into heritability. It eats into environmentality, you frumpus. What it means is that your genes create your environment. Okay? The heritability of environment means that your genes create environment. For example, your parents. First off, you share straight up 50% absolute genetic similarity with your parents from kinship. But their phenotypic similarity is going to be greater than even that implies, because through assortative mating, similar people get together. It's not random. So even if the genetic similarity you have with your parents is 50% versus 0% with a random stranger, your similarity in genetic behavioral tendencies is going to be something like 70%. So say parents have some impact on IQ. Okay, who are your parents? Or let's say your peer group influenced your personality. Well, you tend to seek out peers who are similar in behavior to you. And while the increased quantitative genetic similarity of your friends is trivial, you're seeking out people who behave like you, and your behavior up to that point, when you first met your friends, are a function of your genes and family environment. Family environment itself being a product largely of your genes. So the heritability of diet is around 0.3. The heritability of engaging in exercise is around 0.4. But let's tug on that thread a little further. Say the heritability of engaging in exercise is, as we said, 0.4. Okay, that means 60% of the variance in you choosing to exercise is a function of environmental variance. Oh, but wait a minute, environmental variance, what's that? Is that environmental variance which impacts your decision to exercise? How much of that is influenced by your peer group? Or how much of that so-called environmental variance in your decision to exercise is a function of your parents? So there's the heritability of environment, but its inception again because the environment proportion of your behavior choices are themselves a result of things like family and peer group. Influenced by TV? Are you influenced by TV? Is that an environmental effect? Why do you watch TV? I bet if your family never watched TV, you'd watch a lot less. Oh, but that's a family effect. That's environmental. Who's your family? Okay. This is what is known as broad sense heritability, or a term I like to use that I think is better is the genetic mesh. That these things that at first glance appear like an environmental effect acting on your genome, sort of you have your genome, you have environments, and they just neatly influence your genome. These are actually roundabout expressions of your own genetics. And when you see this, right, when you see the genetic mesh, suddenly you've discovered genetic determinism. Environment ain't all it's cracked up to be, but it's all just down to how you define environment. And when I first digging into the heritability of environment, it's at this point you discover a dirty little secret, which is that heritability estimates depend on where you draw the line on environment. And so going back to this poll on what experts think about the heritability of the black-white IQ gap, you see some of the experts saying that they think it's 100%. Crazy, right? Who thinks it's 100%? Well, what do you mean by heritability? You can get whatever numbers you want depending on how far out you define heredity. Womb environment? Some people had bad womb. Okay, why is your mom smoking? Why didn't your mom breastfeed? However, when we say heritability using things like twin studies, we're using what is called narrow sense heritability. We're treating all these family and peer effects as an independent environmental effect, right? We're not going down the rabbit hole of the genetic mesh. But if you're truly looking for the full weight of genetic effects on a person's behavior, that's going to be higher than the heritability estimates you get from twin studies. Broad sense heritability is fuzzy though, because you can go broad enough to where genetic determinism becomes true, right? You define roundabout genetic effects so broadly that genetic determinism ends up being true. And so in that sense, genetic determinism is not wrong. It's just a matter of perspective. And you're not wrong in saying genetic determinism is true once you realize that almost all environments nowadays are man-made. Things like weather, the jungle, aren't really relevant anymore in the US or in NATO countries or EU countries. And going further, say you're in a desert part of the US, and say living in a desert has some causal impact on your personality or intelligence or height or flatulence or whatever. Okay, why do you live in a desert? What are the genetic correlates of people who choose to live in Arizona? There's probably some. So heritability can get really, really fuzzy if you want it to. But Shaun, this fuzziness, it's not in your favor. The fuzziness goes one way. It doesn't go both ways, right? It goes one way, and that is to increase the influence of genetics through roundabout genetic effects. The fuzziness is how much we expand on genetic explanations for variance in behavior. Environment doesn't expand in this way unless you want to talk about environmental effects on your genes, which in the long run is just Darwinian evolution. Broad sense environmentality would just be Darwinian evolution. Now, you can get cute and exotic and talk about epigenetics, but those effects are very small. 99.9% of epigenetic effects are canceled, are silenced in the germline. Intergenerational effects are mostly a meme. However, epigenetic effects in your own lifetime could matter, but who cares, because those get modeled as environmental effects anyway, so they're already taken into account. So epigenetic effects are kind of like a mixture of people misunderstanding what it is, not understanding they get canceled out in the germline, and not realizing that they're already in the models. But then go back to the issue. But then we go back to the issue where we're talking about racial gaps. Shaun, since this is about race, let's not pussyfoot that. It's not enough to say epigenetic effects could matter if you're bringing up epigenetic effects. You have to show that it does. Sure, small doses of cyanide over one's lifetime could matter. And racial variance in cyanide or lead could theoretically cause some difference in IQ, but it's an empirical question whether or not it actually does. Hereditarian predictions. Shaun also likes to gesticulate that hereditarians keep kicking the can down the line, saying hard molecular genetic evidence will vindicate us one day, but that it's never happened, according to Shaun. Well, first off, the molecular genetic evidence as it comes in is currently vindicating hereditarians, as I'll point out, but the hereditarians have been vindicated long before any of this. The fact that the racial gaps still persist, this is an ongoing vindication of hereditarians, because they were supposed to close with all these environmental narrowings and affirmative action. Like all these were supposed to have an effect, and they were predicted to have an effect at the time. In fact, I recall, I have source amnesia on this, but I recall several of the proponents of affirmative action when it was first being put in place in the 1950s, and more so in the 1960s, was that this would only need to be done for a single generation, referencing prior European immigrant groups. But of course, obviously, that never happened. That never panned out. Now, you can excuse this and say, well, the reason the black-white gap doesn't narrow, and it hasn't, then that's another myth to deal with, the myth that the black-white IQ gap is narrowing. The reason that this hasn't happened, their excuse is the reason it doesn't narrow is because black people are horribly discriminated against while whites aren't. The problem is all these environmental claims that they bring up, they have been proven failures. Test bias was shown to be a non-factor. Stereotype threat was shown to not actually manifest in real-world situations. Blood lead levels don't vary by race to any significant degree. Moreover, whites in the past had much higher blood lead levels, and yet their raw scores were much higher. Malnutrition is actually higher in Southeast Asia than in Sub-Saharan Africa, by the way. And there's almost no evidence of significant nutrition effects between blacks and whites in the US. Voucher studies have shown decisively that school quality doesn't matter, that good schools is a meme. Some vague generalized notion of racism, that racism causes a low IQ, that doesn't seem to pan out because we've been doing this for long enough that we've gotten to a point where racism is presumably decreasing, and the gaps haven't decreased, though really it's just anti-white racism that's increasing. And we can also look at immigrant groups, and in the second generation, they narrow IQ gaps and all other gaps. And yet, presumably, there was no decrease in negative opinions towards Italians or towards Irish, at least not until the behavioral gaps closed between those groups. Those behavioral gaps closed between those groups in a single generation, and once the behavioral gaps closed in that single generation, then all of the conceptions about Irish went away, right? As soon as the Irish stopped acting differently, they stopped being seen differently. Okay, and so the perception of the Irish was accurate to their actual behavior. Once they stopped behaving the way they did, differently from the European American majority, the native white population, we don't even know who the Irish are anymore. Here's another sort of pinch test on this. College performance. You got these groups, blacks and Hispanics, that are supposedly put upon. So they're put into higher universities than they really should be at. But once they get there, their performance is actually lower than whites with identical SAT scores. Which is to say, out of high school, for a given SAT score, whites have more upside potential than blacks or Hispanics. Now, if someone has been put upon and been, environmentally deprived or intellectually deprived up to that point, you would expect them to have more upside potential. Not that they would completely close the gap, but that they would close some of the gap, because now they're getting the same sort of opportunities that the white people have always had once they get to college. But that's not the case. In fact, it's just the opposite, that the gap between them and whites expands a little bit, right? Which is evidence that, if anything, whites are the ones more intellectually deprived given an intellectual level, because this is all scaled across the population. So it's not that, I'm not saying that whites have fewer intellectual opportunities than blacks. They probably have more. What I am saying is that for a genetic cognitive ability, blacks have more intellectual opportunities. That a black person with, say, a genetic IQ of 110 is going to have more intellectual opportunities than a white person with a genetic IQ of 110. That's what this seems to imply. So, no, every year these racial gaps persist is just an ongoing vindication of hereditarians. Moreover, the raw scores, not the rank order scores, but the raw scores on IQ, they're finally starting to fall around the world. Something that hereditarians predicted, but environmentarians did not. Hereditarians were saying, the gains from IQ, they're not G-loaded. The gains from IQ, they negatively correlate with heritability. Look at the breeding patterns. Lower IQ people within all races are having more kids than high IQ people. So you're going to continue to get gains from education and nutrition, but you're going to get to a certain point where you're no longer getting any more gains from education and nutrition, and you're just going to start seeing the effects of genetic decline. And it's happened. The effects of genetic decline are starting to manifest just as the hereditarians predicted. Hereditarians predicted racial gaps would be on the more heritable subtests, and they are. Hereditarians predicted G would be more heritable than non-G subtests. And oh look, that's exactly what ended up being the case. And it's been long enough for these gaps to be gone. And with the exception of first-generation immigrants, if these gaps aren't gone, then it's heritable, genetic, and as far as we care, immutable. Maybe sometime in the future, some technology will come online that can make everyone super smart, but from where we are now, as far as we're concerned, it is functionally immutable. Now, all that said, the molecular genetic data, as it dribbles in, all vindicates hereditarians. So I'm putting up a table on here, for those just sort of listening, of the known genetic variants associated with general intelligence within populations. Now, this isn't just looking at genes associated with skin color, seeing that they correlate with IQ, and just assuming those genes cause an IQ gap. Because you could do that. You could take someone's genome, just run raw correlations, and find gene associations with skin color strongly correlate with IQ. That's not what we're doing. Or that's not what these guys are doing, excuse me. They're validating SNPs within as many populations as they can. And in every one of these genes we find, SNPs, locations at genes, we find the race gaps fit the hereditarian model in almost exactly the order hereditarians would predict. There are a few surprises here and there, but none which benefits the environmentarians. The genes line up as hereditarians would predict, and the countries line up as the hereditarians would predict. But between country comparisons are, of course, more fraught because there's far more environmental variation between countries than within them. And so not surprisingly, you see weaker correlations between countries than you do within countries between IQ and polygenic scores. The polygenic scores explain less of the between country variance than they do the within country variance. Now, one criticism you can make is that SNPs relevant to polygenic scores are determined using disproportionately European samples. And it's true, the sample set is something like 90% European to determine the relevant SNPs in the first place, but why should that matter? Right? Ironically, this argument, which Shaun didn't make, but I'm just going to address it anyway, this argument rests on the idea that different populations have different gene architectures. So, in fact, so much so that the same allele can have a different effect in an African population than it does in a European population. Okay, but wait a minute. What happened to race doesn't real? What happened to just a social construct, right? Now, I think this is all kind of, because this is just a made-up counter. This is just a made-up opposition. I don't think this is actually the case. I don't think races actually differ enough to where the fundamental gene architecture is different, as seen by the fact that mixed race populations have IQs that are the same as their parents. There's no hybrid vigor, and there's also no outbreeding depression. Humans are in reality similar enough that genetic effects are additive and epistatic effects can just be ignored, at least in the big picture. Now, these are all done using a small number of genes. And from a molecular genetic standpoint, we can explain something like 30% of the general variance in IQ now within the US. You could say that's low, but keep in mind, back in 2011, it was like 9%. I remember, I was there. And back when the environmentarians, and back then, when it was 9%, environmentarians were harping that this is what the heritability actually was. And that missing heritability is just a myth. The real heritability of IQ is 9%. Well, now they would have to say it's 30%, at least. No, the heritability was always there. The molecular geneticists are starting to find it. It's just a lot harder than they thought it would be, as most things are. You could claim, oh, but the molecular geneticists haven't explained everything yet, and that's true, but what they have explained so far all vindicates hereditary predictions. Hereditary predictions that were made as far back as the 1900s, a little bit before even. It's like we're going through a tunnel system in a cave. I predicted it will look a certain way. You predicted it will look another way. Now, we're going through the cave. We're 30% of the way through the cave. My predictions thus far have been 90% correct. There were a few surprises, but not many. And your predictions for how the cave is going to look have been 0% correct. And your response to me is that, well, we haven't gone through the whole of the cave yet. There's still 70% to go. I could still be right in the end. Okay, but probably not. At this point, if you know any of this molecular genetic stuff that's coming in, and you're still promoting institutional racism, right, which you euphemistically call affirmative action, and all the related things like that, then you're just a racist. That's what it comes down to. You're just a racist. And fundamentally, that's what this is all about. It's about institutional racism directed against European Americans. Because you have life outcome differences between groups. You got all these gaps, right? All these gaps in income, gaps in wealth and health, basically. And this is said to be white people's fault, so institutions discriminate against white people to make up for supposed past discrimination. And that's another chestnut in and of itself, the mythologization of segregation and just the hysterical exaggerations of how blacks were kept out and kept away from opportunities and all these myths, right? When in reality, the relative incomes between the races haven't budged hardly at all since the end of segregation. Once you control for the black migration north, right? Blacks today are relatively richer compared to whites today. That is true. There has been a narrowing of the income gap, but that goes away entirely once you control for the fact that blacks left the South. Right? Basically, within each region, the racial disparities in income have been roughly the same. And looking at the molecular genetic data, if you want to say these correlations don't mean anything because the rubric is incomplete, well then what? You're saying that all these countries and populations just lined up with the hereditary predictions by random chance? You think that the whole of the data would show that all these countries and all these populations would be the same in terms of polygenic score, but that the slice that we have access to just so happens to completely slam dunk vindicate the hereditarians? You think that once we understand the rest of the genome, we'll suddenly see the opposite? The opposite so much to the effect that it's going to cancel out what we have so far, and the outcome will be all populations have an identical polygenic score? If you understand what's going on, the environmentarian position just becomes a joke, a matter of faith, a matter of social proof and pressure, fear of being ostracized, fear of being banned, fear of losing your job. That's what it becomes revealed to be, because the evidence is so overwhelmingly on the side of the hereditarians that the idea that evolution stopped at the neck, which is ridiculous in its first instance, right, before even having any evidence one way or another regarding race differences and abilities, the idea that they're all going to be the same, that's a moral idea that sort of got transmuted into a claim about physical reality. If you want to say all people are of identical moral worth, well, first off, I would argue about that because, does raping and murdering, does that increase or decrease your moral worth? But we won't go down that rabbit hole. If you want to say all people are of the same moral worth, fine, that's like your opinion, that's sort of a moral idea. But somewhere along the line, this moral notion of equality of a person or some notion of human dignity got transmuted into a claim about physical reality. And I think that's the root of all this environmentarian nonsense. Okay, so I'll end on this. Shaun also denies the existence of biological races in humans, and he appeals to some mythological consensus on this. First off, in weird countries of what is thought of as the West, physical and biological anthropologists are 2-to-1 in denial of biological race according to surveys. There was a recent one that's being bandied about showing more anthropologists deny race than they did in the 1990s, but when you read further down and just look at physical and biological anthropologists like the older surveys did, it's still 2-to-1. So in the West, sure, Shaun has a majority of those people on his side. As for biologists, unfortunately, there are no recent surveys of biologists that I know of. However, surveys from the 1980s have always had biologists being slightly more likely to recognize biological race in humans than did physical anthropologists. And given no trend for physical and biological anthropologists, biologists are also probably at about 2-to-1 in denial of race in the West, perhaps a little bit less. It's probably a little bit closer than for physical and biological anthropologists because it was in the past, and there's no reason to assume that trend hasn't held to today. So a clear majority in favor of Shaun's position in the West, but the majority isn't nearly as big as you might imagine if you read Vox all day. Now, in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries, it's the opposite. About 2-to-1 recognizes race, and in China, the recognition of biological race is at nearly 100%. Which is to say, Shaun's consensus on biological race is largely mythical and based on perceptions formed inside the science TM bubble. But on to the matter itself. I will start off by saying a thing that is true. Are you ready to hear the thing that is true? Okay. The existence of or non-existence of biological races in humans is irrelevant to there being biological race differences in intelligence. The reason being that you can have two groups of people divided in any which way. People who part their hair to the left or the right, innie versus outie belly buttons, people who like anime versus people who don't like anime, And you can take whatever two groups of people, you can scan their genomes, and they can differ in what, for convenience, I'll call genetic intelligence. The groups of people being compared do not have to rise to some level of absolute genetic distance or clusteredness in order for them to radically differ in genetic propensity to intelligence or any other trait for that matter. Two populations could differ on a single allele frequency, and that single allele difference could explain a radical population difference. This is known to be true for things like sickle cell anemia and Tay-Sachs disease. So that should be the starting point, that humans don't have to rise to, say, subspeciation for us to draw meaningful comparisons to visible population groups. And these visible population groups could differ radically in genetic traits. That said, humans do meet most commonly used standards for subspeciation. They pass the 75% rule, they have enough total genetic heterozygosity, and this heterozygosity is clustered well enough to be a subspecies when compared to other mammals with similar values in these criteria. And there are several recognized subspecies which have differentiated faster than human races have. So the idea that there's not enough time for humans to have subspeciation, it's not only silly on its face because humans have a greater geographic range than any other mammal, and they achieved this geographic range faster than any other mammal we know of. So for humans to have the fastest subspeciation of any mammal wouldn't be some great surprise. But as it happens, there were other subspecies that subspeciated faster than humans have, so we don't have to bother with this not enough time argument. Now, taxonomy is not a science. Categories are conventions, because out in nature, biology doesn't give a shit about man-made rules and categorization schemes. So there's no actual correct answer on whether or not humans have races, because it's just a category. And because of this, scientists have enough wiggle room that they can, I don't know, say black people don't exist or something. But humans do meet all the generally recognized criteria for subspeciation. It's just that scientists have a bug up their butt about treating humans the same way they would treat any other animal. Interestingly enough, animal biologists, amongst the biologists, animal biologists are the ones most likely to recognize biological races in humans, at least they were in the 1980s, at something like over 70%. So I find it interesting that animal biologists are the ones most likely to treat humans like another animal, and thus are likely to use the same sort of rubrics and standards for humans as they use for animals, and say humans have subspeciation. Again, not that it matters, because we can just draw circles around whoever we want and compare the genetic differences between them, whether you think they constitute a biological race or not.